All right, so we're going to get a little cultural with you here as we explore one of the artistic movements of the 1920s. It is called the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to look at some of the art, some of the literature, and some of the music that comes out of this period of time. The Harlem Renaissance, Harlem is a neighborhood in New York. It's a predominantly black neighborhood, and so some of these artists are going to be coming from there. Really, what the Harlem Renaissance, what that phrase comes to mean, is an explosion of African American culture into the larger American consciousness. So, jazz, some of these styles of paintings, these authors are going to be coming from really what had been for most of our history an underrepresented group, and so they are going to be sharing themselves, their art, in new ways that not only reached African American culture at the time, but reached the larger culture as a whole. And so it's going to build some bridges of understanding between different ethnic groups as well. Really, two things the Harlem Renaissance is going to seek to do. One is it seeks to represent African American culture as it existed in the 1920s. So, kind of saying, this is my experience. The other is a connection back to the culture that was lost when they were separated from Africa, or the ancestors of these folks were separated from Africa. You know, when people were drug onto those slave ships, they lost a connection to a culture. And so for some folks, the Harlem Renaissance was trying to look back and say, all right, these are our cultural roots back on this whole other continent. And so I've got some paintings and some stories and things that I'd like to share with you. The Harlem Renaissance happens really because in the aftermath of slavery, um, it's going to be really kind of one of two options that these former slaves are going to be able to do, right? You really just go back to doing the same kind of work you were doing as a slave, or for some of them it was, I'm not staying here anymore. I'm not going to get a fair shake at these places in the South. I'm going to move. And so we see something in history called the Great Migration. And groups of African Americans are going to leave the South and move to large cities in the North. So places like Chicago, New York, Cincinnati are going to see an influx of these folks coming in. And like we saw with immigrants in the Industrialization and Immigration Unit, these folks are going to live in the same neighborhoods. It was safer that way. You had more in common that way. And so we start to see neighborhoods pop up in these cities that are predominantly black, like we said with Harlem in New York. And so these folks are coming together, they're working, and really a generation or two later, when we get to the 1920s, you see their children and grandchildren looking to express what life is like for them in the 1920s. And then, like I said, a connection back to these more ancient roots that they had. And so you've got an opportunity, two or three generations past slavery, for people to earn money being artistic, being musicians, painters, and things like that. And so there's just this huge cultural explosion that's going to happen. First group we're going to look at are the authors that are going to be here. I've dropped some movies or some short videos onto the YouTube playlist. I encourage you to go take a look. There's some neat stuff that you're going to see there. One of the most famous book authors of this period of time is a lady named Zora Neale Hurston. She's really famous for several different things, but her most famous work is a book called Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is one that's on your college-bound list. And it is very much set in kind of the day, the 19 teens and 20s. And they actually made a movie out of it several years ago. Didn't particularly care for the movie, but the book was a good book. But she's talking about kind of the experience. The main character is a black woman living in this time, and just the struggles of um, making it in her modern American society. She had kind of a rough time. A lot of times, artists will have patrons, right? People that pay them or support them while they're working, right? Because if you're writing a book, you're not going to the factory every day to bring home a check every 2 weeks. And so there were people that were so impressed with her writing skill that they were supporting her work as an artist. Most of her patrons, though, were white, which upset some members of the African American community. Uh, but at the same time, she was never looked at as equal with those white patrons either. So she really kind of has two cultures that are pulling at her, and no place where she can feel like she can truly belong. And I think that's something you see come out in her work. We've got a couple of poets as well. Langston Hughes is a very famous poet. He's kind of the biggest name that comes from the Harlem Renaissance. And so I've got a couple of poems. One is going to be here, and he's going to read it. The next one's a video, and I'll put that video on the playlist, so if you're watching this at home. But I'll play this Langston Hughes clip here at the beginning. It's just his words with one of his famous poems.
This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. And I think you can tell just maybe that connection back to looking at the history, right? You go back to the Euphrates, and that's one of the rivers that bordered the Garden of Eden. So he's casting this history back all the way to the beginning of man. Then, of course, name dropping Abraham Lincoln there as well. Kind of casting back, looking at some of those cultural things that way. Like I said, I've got another one there for you to check out on the playlist. This poem is by a fellow named Countee Cullen, another famous poet from the Harlem Renaissance. This one is called The Incident, and it is more of a modern poem, what it's like to be black in modern America. And he tells the story here of being a little boy visiting Baltimore for the first time, and then having his first experience with racism. And not only with racism, but with racism coming from a child his own age. and just how affecting that was. So you see a lot of that coming out in the literature of the time. Uh, you also see artwork that is going to shape the Harlem Renaissance. Some of it was, like I said, casting back to those ancient days. A lot of African artwork, if you ever go to an art museum, you see that happens in statues and masks. And so that was something that was produced during the Harlem Renaissance. You've got um, going back to traditional hairstyles, a celebration of African American facial features that you see in a lot of these statues. And again, just trying to connect back to what they felt like was a lost culture or a stolen culture. Paintings as well. And there are some different styles of paintings that you see. Just picked several that I like. The one in the upper left-hand corner here, I think, does a really neat job of suggesting motion. Except for the poor fellow playing the drum there, who really doesn't look happy to be there. Everybody seems like they're having a good time dancing, but you see you can almost hear the music and see these people dancing. The one on the far right is one called The Garbage Man Who Paints. A lot of times with Harlem Renaissance art, you'll see exaggerated colors or physical features. You can see it in the top and bottom one too. A lot of times faces don't have eyes or any kind of facial features that are there. I like the Garbage Man Who Paints because it's very realistic, but it seems to suggest, this guy's coming home from a hard day at work, and there's more to him, right? He's an artist. Maybe people don't realize that when he's picking up their trash, but there's a whole nother side to him. And I think probably a little bit in all of us that would like to think that we're more than what people can just gather about us from a cursory glance. And so I've always kind of liked that one. Not all Harlem Renaissance paintings were as realistic looking. I like this one because I think I know what it's about. And you look at this picture, and religion was an integral part and still is an integral part of the African American community. And so this looks to me like the story of one of the Negro spirituals that would be sung in the fields, right? The idea of swinging low the sweet chariots, and people, a lot of times crossing a river was looked at as being a term used for crossing over from death or from life into death or the afterlife. And so we see that sort of imagery here in these angelic figures who are crossing the river to have these people or to be greeted by Moses, Jesus, God, whoever it is on the other side of the river, bringing them in. And so I thought that's a neat example of Harlem Renaissance art as well. One of the things, and you're going to have to head to the playlist to see this one. One of the art forms that comes out is jazz. Jazz is looked at as being the first distinctly American art form. It means it was created here. Most people give the city of New Orleans credit for the creation of jazz, and it goes out then to the rest of the world. It's going to make people famous. It was first looked at as being a race music. So if you'd gone into a record store once those had come around, this was looked at as being a type of music that was belonging to the African American community. There are white bands, and I'll show you one in a second, that do this. A lot of times when white performers would play jazz music, they would do it in blackface, which is something, of course, we would never think of doing today, but back then was kind of the acceptable practice. The guy in the top left is the most famous jazz musician of his time. He's Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was one of the most famous men in the world in the 1920s. Excellent jazz musician. Got some different things on the playlist about Louis Armstrong that you can see. Very distinctive voice and musical style. And when people thought of jazz, he was one of the first names. There are other guys. Duke Ellington comes to mind. that would be there. There are also excellent female jazz musicians, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, that are going to help to push this style of music. And then what happens is, as people hear it, it doesn't matter what color the skin is of the artist who's singing or playing the music. People just like the music. It was good. And so it becomes, kind of crosses racial boundaries. Jazz has got a couple of things that make it a little different. One is the idea of syncopation, and my musical folks will understand that probably better than even I do, but it's an emphasis on a different beat in the music than what is usually emphasized. So it makes jazz sound different. You also had the idea of improvisation. You can go to a jazz concert 2 nights in a row and hear the same songs, but they sound really different because most jazz songs have a time where the musicians and the different instruments had a chance to kind of do their own thing. So depending on what mood the artist was in that night or how the crowd was responding, you may hear very different music. You got a lot of brass instruments. Louis Armstrong's playing the trumpet there. The trombone would be an essential part. You've got some stringed instruments, the stand-up bass, and those types of things that would make jazz very different. And so the 1920s becomes known as the Jazz Age. This really provides the soundtrack for the 1920s, and we'll see it morph into the blues and then eventually into rock and roll and things like that. But it all gets its start with jazz. The second uniquely American art form also will make an appearance in late 20s and early 30s. It's comic books, and I like that one as well. So I'm going to put some jazz music on the playlist for you to take a listen to, and hopefully, if it's not something you're going to add to your iPods or your musical playlist, at least it's something you can appreciate, and you can appreciate some of the roots of that music that go into the music that you enjoyed today.